But when they've got everything on the God's living earth that they can eat and they can wear and they can live in, and all that their children can live in and wear and eat and all their children's children can use, then we got to call Mr. Morgan and Mr. Mellon and Mr. Rockefeller back and say, come back here. Put that stuff back on this table here that you took away from here, that you don't need. Leave.
Do. Because the truth is, we still live in a country where there are two different Americas. One for all those people who have lived the American dream and don't have to worry. And another for most Americans, everybody else, who struggle to make ends meet every single day. It doesn't have to be that way. We can build one America. We can build one America where we no longer have two healthcare systems. One for families that get the best healthcare money can buy, and then one for everybody else, rationed out by insurance companies, drug companies, HMOs. We shouldn't have two public school systems in this country, one for the most affluent communities and one for everybody else. None of us believe that the quality of a child's education should be controlled by where they live or the affluence of the community they live in. I believe that we shouldn't have two different economies in this country. One for people who are set for life. They know their kids and their grandkids are going to be just fine. And then one for most Americans. People who live paycheck to paycheck. You don't need me to explain this to you, do you? You know exactly what I'm talking about. Can't save any money, can you? Takes every dime you make just to pay your bills. And you know what happens if something goes wrong? If you have a child that gets sick, a financial problem, a layoff in the family, you go right off the cliff. And when that happens, what's the first thing that goes?
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came,
and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order.
A new world order.
we saw.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the law. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House?
He died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
You can keep it. Period. 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 They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 020, Survival of the Richest. Our guest tonight is Donald Jeffries, the author of the book, Survival of the Richest, How the Corruption of the Marketplace and the Disparity of Wealth Created the Greatest Conspiracy of All. He'll join us next in the Midnight Hour. But first, as always, a little cleaning of the castle. Our Facebook page is at Midnight Rider News Show. That's Midnight Rider News Show. Please like us there. Our Twitter is MWN_STPatrick, MWN_STPatrick, and we have links to both on MidnightRiderNews.com. So please join us there. Our email remains unchanged. It is still MidnightWriterNews@gmail.com. Now, don't forget that writer is spelled WRITER, as in someone who writes. So we would like to thank any new listeners that may be with.
But when they've got everything on the God's living earth that they...
The archives. Now, the archives have a link at the top of the page. You just hit where it says MWN Show Archives, and it'll take you to a list of the guests and the topics that we've discussed so far. In the episode number, it'll have a link to the actual episode where you can either listen to the show or download the show. So we all hope you take advantage of the episodes we've produced so far and listen to those. Thank you. So before we get to Donald Jeffries, we're going to spend a couple minutes with John Goodwin of Galaxy Press. Now, Galaxy has kindly decided to allow Midnight Rider News readers to download something for free. Now, I'm going to let John tell you what that is. So, John, thanks for joining us, and how are you this evening?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for having me on your show, ST.
Now, John, you have a special offer for anyone that goes to MidnightRiderNews.com or listens to our show. So tell us a little bit about what that is.
It's a booklet that Jim Marrs wrote called Alien Invasion, Is Earth Prepared? And he put it together because over the last year, Jim and I have become very, very good friends. And a lot of the events we went to together, people were asking him about alien invasion and what his views were on, are they real, are UFOs real or not, and what about this, what about that. So he prepared this booklet with a lot of the researches he'd had over the last, I guess, 4 or 5 decades as a critical researcher.
John, how did you meet Jim Marrs?
Well, we had a mutual friend who, when he found out I was looking for somebody to be a spokesperson for a release of a book called Battlefield Earth, turns out that Jim was very familiar with the author's writings since the 1950s. He had been reading L. Ron Hubbard during the Pulp Fiction era. So having read Battlefield, he said, I'd love to do it. And he loves books. I mean, Jim Marrs was just, he's a 5 times New York Times bestselling author. And so he loves everything about books. And so he says, I'll talk about your books. Because he was asked about his books too. So the parallels were constantly throughout between Battlefield Earth and what he wrote, especially on his alien agenda and those types of things, ruled by secrecy. Both those things kind of like correlated throughout the book. So he was able to talk about his books. And when we went to Alien Con and Contact in the Desert, we were always there helping to sell. And we'd give him a space at our booth. And he'd just have a heck of a good time just being able to talk to people and selling his books. And then he helped us sell ours. But because he was asked so many questions all the time, he said, okay, when I go to Alien Con, I want to have another booklet that I can give to people so that nobody's going to walk away without getting something from me. So that's when he prepared this booklet.
That absolutely sounds like Jim. So, John, from all the time you spent with Jim, what's the one thing that stands out to you most?
I think when we were just going over his philosophy of life, and it was at a lunch we had at a restaurant here in Hollywood. He loved his burgers and beer, so we went there, and over that he was talking about. I mean, he was so American. He so loved America and its values and what it stood for. And with him, he was very much politically. It wasn't so much that he was for Trump. He was just against Hillary. He was against anybody he figured that was a globalist. That was his thing. Was the whittling away of our liberty. He saw that in part a lot due to the globalization and that type of stuff where we take away our rights. So he was very much against that. So what really stood out for me the most about him was he was very much about God, country, and his friends. And that was more important. He'd say, I've heard of rich and famous. I've got the famous part down, but I never did quite get that rich part.
I can only imagine.
Totally, So that's for me, it was he was very real. He was very objective, so he was a reporter, for crying out loud. He was very objective. He'd look at something from all the different angles, and no matter who came and talked to him about with their opinions that were at variance or in agreement with him, he'd hear him out. He'd say, whatever you have to say, let's agree to disagree then. But he was always willing to talk and discuss and deal with things by communication, not by what you have going right now with all that the hate and the fake news. He was like, he couldn't track with that. That was just so unreal to him that was what was evolving now, because that wasn't the way he was at all.
Right. You know, it's still such a tragic loss, and it's still so hard to believe that it happened.
Oh, it's very hard. In fact, if I might, tell you this is, we always became, very close with him, and so we were in regular communication with his wife, Carol, and so we were planning for the next wave of what we were doing on Battlefield Earth, and Jim was going to be hitting the radio waves and television waves again for this, and we were going to be going to Contacting the Desert, and he had to cancel that at the last moment, and then he had he was in a hospital dealing with his kidney issues, and then we were in touch, with Carol, and she said, okay, he's starting to come together, a little bit better, so maybe 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, we should, be able to start doing interviews again. Then a week later, she called us and told us that he passed this morning with a heart attack, and it was like a shock to her. It was a total shock to us.
Yeah. Do you happen to know if there are any more writings out there by Jim that might eventually be released?
Well, there's another book. I'm quickly trying to. I think it's released now. It was getting ready to. That was the last thing he wrote. The book we've got here that we're offering here is the last book that he wrote on anything alien or ufology, the Illuminati. Yes, that's one that just got released in May. Yeah, he released it in spring. So that's the most recent one that just released. I've not read that one yet, but I definitely went through the growing pains with him as he was writing. He told me, okay, so I submitted it. Now they want me to do this. Now I need to do that. And now they want me another 30,000 words. And so we'd have to reschedule his media based upon his demands to get this submitted. But that was the last book that he wrote. But he's just, if I can tell you, there's one fun story about Jim. He was. He had a cannon. He had a cannon in his backyard, and a Confederate cannon. And he would never, he'd always be calm, cool, and collected when he talked to people. And he'd say, "Boy, that guy was really rough." And he wouldn't talk to me, but he would never take it out on the, where he's talking to people. He said, "But I love my cannon. I go back home and I just take my cannon, I load it up, and I just pull that, light the fuse and just pull it, and it's just all my frustrations go with that big boom." And he told this that he said that's how he handled his frustrations, when just firing that cannon and got his frustrations out. And he said there was one time when the start of hunting season happened, and there was, these pesky hunters all over the place, because he lived sort of off the grid, outside of Dallas Fort Worth. And you see the hunting season was starting, here this pop, 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 with the guns, and sometimes a little boom, pop, pop, these different guns there, and it was just a nuisance for him, because they kept on distracting him. So he got his cannon, and he set the cannon, and it was boom, and he said it went totally quiet. Everything just, no more popping or anything. He just totally went quiet after that. He had such a kick out of that.
I'm sure that he did. And this has been John Goodwin from Galaxy Press. John, thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing your stories of Jim Marrs.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the ability to, Jim Marrs was such a dear friend, to be able to, pay continued respects to him. So thank you very much.
John Goodwin for Galaxy Press. If you'd like to know more about Galaxy Press and what they do, go to galaxypress.com. That's galaxypress.com. If you'd like to read Alien Invasion, Is the Earth Prepared?, a booklet by Jim Marrs, you can find that, thanks to Galaxy Press, on midnightridernews.com. So go there and read the new one by Jim Marrs. So we'll be right back with Donald Jeffries. It's the most beloved film in American cinema. Journey back to Rick's Cafe American as we discuss the making of Casablanca in episode 12 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
Hi, this is Noah Eisenberg, author of We'll Always Have Casablanca, the life, legend, and afterlife of Hollywood's most beloved movie. If you want to know the behind-the-scenes story of Bogart Bergman and Casablanca then and now, download episode 12 of the Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick.
There is so much to say about this next guest, but let us begin by saying that he was on episode 004 to discuss the phenomenal Hidden History and Expose of Modern Crimes, Conspiracies, and Cover-Ups in American Politics. And for the record, no, I promise not to grovel and beg tonight for the release of Hidden History Part 2. I do make that promise ahead of time, but rather Donald, a friend of the show, and I would go so far as to say a friend in general, is going to join us to talk about his new, very important work, Survival of the Richest, How the Corruption of the Marketplace and the Disparity of Wealth Created the Greatest Conspiracy of All. Now, I'm not sure that Survival of the Richest is more controversial per se, at least not in the conventional sense. Yet, I believe it's a more challenging book than Hidden History. And by that I mean challenging to the way many of us were raised, challenging to the way many of us still believe, and challenging to the elites in society that the middle and lower classes, for whatever reason, keep defending ad nauseum. So tonight we question the survival of the richest. So, hey Donald, how are you tonight? Thank you for being on the show again.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Let's start here, Donald. When I was young, these many years ago, I was told to go to college, find a career, buy a home, work 35 years for someone else, and retire. That was the American dream. Is that even possible anymore?
Well, I think it was the American dream for a while, but no, I don't think it's possible anymore. I grew up a little before you. I'm at the tail end of the baby boomer generation, so that was certainly what we were told to do, and it did seem to work that way for a while, especially the working at a company for a long period of time. That's actually worked against people for quite a while. I think they kind of look down on you if what are you, some kind of loser, being the same company for 20, 30 years? But yeah, unfortunately, the American dream in many ways, and Survival of the Richest certainly, I hope, delineates that. But it's a shame what has happened, especially in the last 30, 35 years in this country. It's just amazing the way we've seen a transfer of wealth upwards into the hands of very, very few.
Right, and especially this idea of college. Is it still a valuable experience to go to college for 4 years and pay all that money for that experience? When, if everyone goes, isn't the experience diluted?
Well, I mean, that's what I've said to many people, is that, with more degrees, you flood the market. I mean, if you're familiar with collectibles, the more people buy a particular comic book or a baseball card, what makes it valuable is the rarity. And obviously, it's the same thing with anything. The more college degrees you have, obviously, the less valuable each one becomes. And as I demonstrate in the book with the statistics, is sure, college is a great deal if you can go to one of the top 146 colleges as they've rate them. The problem is only 11% of the people from the bottom, only 3% of people from the bottom income quadrille, go to those top 146 colleges. And that's when factoring in lots of football and basketball players who aren't really legitimate students that are coming from poverty. They're there for other reasons, not because they're there, it's for the education. And only 10% come from the bottom half of the country. So the top colleges, the Ivy League schools, and so forth, the ones that guarantee you success, you're pretty much already wealthy, or at least coming from a stable upper middle class background if you're going there. So there isn't any upward mobility. As for the other kind of colleges, community colleges and state colleges, ones that aren't rated quite that high, depends on what kind of degree you get. But I mean, people that are getting generic business degrees, if I was in college today, I'd probably get a degree in literature or maybe history. Not going to be worth much, except maybe you can possibly become a teacher, maybe a public school teacher, and make a okay wage, but nothing special. But yeah, it's not that they have a big video out there I would urge everyone to watch called The College Conspiracy. It's got a lot of hits out there on YouTube, and it shows you're not getting, and with the average student debt, I think it's up to $32,000 now, which is just amazing. So if you're graduating with an average of $32,000 worth of debt, and it's a debt that can't be wiped out by even bankruptcy, you're saddled with it for life, and you're going to be lucky to get a job making $30,000 a year. I don't know. I'm not a young college student today, but I wouldn't feel like I got my money's worth in a situation like that.
Oh, absolutely not. But the problem I see with it, though, and please tell me if I'm wrong, is that we're in a very precarious situation regarding the availability of an affordable university education. Now, politicians like Bernie Sanders have advocated for free or very low-cost college, which would thus drive enrollment up and flood the market, as you said. However, if we keep the costs higher so that the great deluge of degrees in the marketplace doesn't happen, then aren't we just making college available for the upper 25% who can afford it? And then doesn't that just feed the, say, survival of the richest, so to say? So I'm not sure which way to turn on this issue, Donald. So how do we resolve this?
Yeah, and it's another one of those situations where if we had real, leadership with vision and insight, then we could solve it. But our leaders can't think out of the box. They just recite the same pablum, the same kind of empty rhetoric about education, getting the children education, and they don't have any idea of how each if everyone does get a degree, as you said, it dilutes the value of all of them. And we still have the type of workforce that existed 50, 60, 70 years ago when factories were plentiful. You had people that didn't have an education, because not everyone's meant to have an education, and even if they were, as we said, in an ideal world, let's say everyone gets a doctorate from Harvard. Well, what's the value of a doctorate from Harvard then? So if everyone in the country has one. So again, we don't have any leaders that can look at the big picture and think outside the box. We have to think about those people that used to work in the factories that did that didn't have to get an education, but were skilled enough to do an essential job, made good wages, and back when you had strong unions, had good benefits, lived good lives, and built cities like Detroit were built on. Look at Detroit; looks like it's been conquered by a foreign enemy now. It's a bombed-out shell of itself. It was once a thriving, one of the pride and joys of America, and it was because of all the auto factories there and so forth. And but no one thinks about that anymore. About what about the people that used to work in these factories, or just the value of any job? When I was a kid, in the 1960s, I knew lots of parents who worked at grocery stores and retail stores as cashiers who made a good living. I was talking to a fellow a few weeks ago, and he was talking to somebody that used to work for a grocery store, I believe it was Giant Food, or maybe Safeway, back in the late 1970s. And he was making, at that time, over $30,000 then. Now, a cashier today at Giant Food wouldn't come close to making that. And that they had strong unions then, and that's people don't realize the impact that had. I mean, and I'm not, I've never belonged to a union. I used to see a lot of bad things about them, but we don't realize, that's just one of the aspects. And I go over all this in the book, but the presence of union and the threat of unions raised salaries and wages for non-union companies all across the board, and it was just a different world. It said, you just look at that example there, where a cashier in a grocery store was making way more 40 years ago than they would be today. And something's wrong with an economy when you have a situation like that.
What I also saw in the first weeks of college was a sort of predatory loan program. Now, what I mean by that is this. I entered college in the fall of 1990, so in the first week, I was sent multiple charge cards for which I'd never applied.
Yeah.
Now, I was obviously not the only one. I mean, they were all over the campus. Now, I, like many, found myself deep in debt due to the various credit card companies. Many would say that it's completely on me, Donald. You know what? I totally see that. I get that. I made a choice. It's on me. But what can Americans do when they work more, have less, and can barely afford to stay afloat? When a hungry man finds food, for example, he eats it. He often doesn't realize what the cost will be. He just eats the food. So the companies know that, or knew that then, and they preyed upon that.
Yeah, and it's a situation obviously that isn't talked about much. I believe it was back in the early '90s, the Republicans, when Gingrich had the contract on with America there. I believe it was the result of that. I remember the ex-NFL player Steve Largent and some other Republicans were talking. They actually held, I think, one series of hearings of trying to cap interest rates on credit. And you would have thought World War III had been declared. I mean, the media and the banks, they went nuts. So that's going to be a hard sell, and you're right about it. But it comes down to the big problem, what I consider the most important political issue today, and that's what it speaks to why credit cards were necessary then and now. Is because most people that work, that are lucky enough to have a job, are not being paid enough to meet the ever increasing cost of living. It all comes down to not being compensated enough. That vast majority of people. So, like you said, I believe it's 76% or more now, depending on the statistics, of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So, when you're in that situation and you have children, I mean, I had children. My children are grown now, but I don't know if you have children. But if you have children, it's not necessarily peer pressure keeping up with the Joneses, but you try to explain to your children, no, you can't have, everybody else has a video game system, but you can't. Everybody else has a flat screen TV, but you can't. When you have a credit card and you can get it, but of course that's how debt gets built up. Unexpected medical expenses, unexpected car expenses, because I believe it's 62% or even 70% of Americans don't have $500 in savings. So, and it's not because they're not frugal enough, or they're being spendthrift. They're not being paid enough. There's nothing there. There's too much a month left at the end of the check, to quote the old saying. And that's the problem, is that the money's not there, things come up. And if you have children especially, how are you going to sit there and tell your kids, you can't have these little essentials that everyone else has? And things like the internet, cable TV, and really smartphones, they become essentials of life, especially to young people. So these are the things. And again, nobody, instead of saying living within your means, again, let's look at why. And again, I cite that grocery store example. That's just one industry right there. And I'm sure I know of other jobs, just knowing people that are making less money than they were 20 years ago. And a lot of it is because of that college conspiracy, because what they're doing now when they come out of college, they're requiring college bachelor's degrees for jobs that used to be just require high school education. They're requiring master's degree for jobs that used to just require bachelor. So all they're doing is they're giving college graduates less for their money. They're giving them jobs that they used to give and that really don't require a college degree. And again, it's to try to say, well, okay, we're going to give you something for going to college, and they're not getting their money's worth. It's a huge mess, and again, it revolves around the fact that most people just simply aren't being paid enough to meet the cost of living.
Let me take the opposing side for just a minute. So, yes, there are severe structural problems. Yes, it is intentional. I absolutely agree with that. But do we also have an economic esteem problem, Donald? Now, what I mean by this is, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, we were all told that we were just as valuable as the doctor or the lawyer. I call this the Oprahfication of America, because I believe it, in part, at least comes from the Oprah Winfrey ideology of that era. However, the advertisers in the same era, Donald, kept telling us that we deserve the same things as those at the high end. So the hourly McDonald's worker eventually began buying the same TV, the same $1,000 iPhone, the same car, and I guess I really saw this start with the Nike Air Jordans around 1985. Now, there was I don't know if you remember, but there was violence over people stealing these shoes from each other. Children stealing these shoes from each other. And now, there's no violence over expensive shoes. Now, it's easy to say, well, that's good, but maybe that's also because they don't have the same value when everyone just charges these expensive items, whether they can actually afford it or not. So I guess this is a two-part question. What responsibility does advertising have in all of this, and how do we overcome it?
Well, certainly, advertising has a great deal of responsibility in terms of appealing to the young, especially, and that goes back to the '60s when we would sit and watch Saturday morning cartoons, and commercial after commercial would be geared to us for the latest sugar-coated cereal up to the latest toy, or certainly not on the scale as we see now, where you're talking about very expensive sneakers or the latest video game system, whatever. But it's the same concept, and then of course, it pressures the parents then again, especially when the friends start buying them. So you run into a whole kind of peer pressure thing there. But I agree with you. There's obviously this unwise purchases, especially among the poor, and you find this. I don't know if it's a matter of pride, but I mean, I can't, the same reason for so many people in poverty drink alcohol or do drugs. And I always say, can you really blame them? I mean, maybe that's all they have to, when they come home from their dismal set of circumstances, they're probably physically demanding job with a boss yelling at them all day. I mean, Is it really something that you wonder about, why they would want to drown their sorrows in alcohol? And again, the working class has been doing that for a long time. So I think these things are kind of predictable where, they're kind of immature decisions, but these were, in many cases, they saw their parents doing the same thing and making unwise decisions too. But I think it all comes down to, and you talked about, telling us that we're all, well, that's the problem, is that I think while the advertisers may say you can have this and you can have that, the marketplace doesn't value us anywhere near equally. And we see this is the problem. It's what I talk about in the book. I mean, why is a vice president of a company or, who's going to make a $200,000, $300,000 a year, basically to sit around a table and nod yes to everything that the head honcho says. Basically be a yes man, or as I I call them vice presidents in charge of looking out of the window. I mean, there's tons of those guys around, and you could probably eliminate 90% of them, and there's not a company they wouldn't even notice. They literally wouldn't even notice they were there. Whereas if you eliminated the custodial crew, you'd know right away. The first day, wow! But again, how much more money are they making in that custodial crew than the file clerk or the data entry clerk, whatever you want to say? So it's again back 50, 60 years ago when we had the post-war boom and the baby that led to the greatest economy America's ever had. We had a whole different philosophy at the top. First of all, they weren't called CEOs; they were just the heads of the company. And although certainly there were tons of really wealthy people, you didn't see the disparity then. Back then, the president of a company might make 20 times what a worker did, maybe 50, not hundreds or even thousands of times like we see now. And that's the problem. It's exploded since the 80s, this new concept of executive bonuses, executive compensation, where they've twisted the law so that they don't have to pay taxes on it because they're not really declaring it as income per se, and they get around it that way. But the idea of laying people off and then starting with Lee Iacocca and people like that in the 80s, we're laying thousands of people off and then getting bigger executive bonuses because you save the company money by laying people off, treating people like little pieces on a chessboard. So there's a civic thing there, and they don't teach civics in school anymore, and they really ought to, because the people that run these companies are the first ones that ought to learn civics, because I think even the worst plutocrats were better. The robber barons were better at understanding, okay, I have, as Henry Ford said, I have to give my workers a raise because I have to pay them enough to buy the product I'm building. The people that run these companies now, well, first of all, there aren't many products left because they've outsourced everything thanks to NAFTA and all these awful trade deals. But the few products that we are making, that you have to pay your employees enough, and I don't think they're paying their employees enough, certainly to purchase, much of anything that they are producing.
Oh, you're exactly right, Donald. Now, I've read some of the excerpts not included in the book, and I have to tell you, one of them was just mind-blowing. And now is probably a great time to mention that Donald's blog, where you can read the unincluded chapters, is the Keeping It Unreal blog, which you can find at donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. Now, in one of those chapters, you really destroy the myth that if we work hard enough, we can work our way into the boardrooms. Now, those doors seem to be a little more closed and a little more favorable to nepotism than we actually think. And more times than not, it really is about who you are more than what you've done, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. One of the deleted chapters in the book was about relationships and where people come from, and I'd urge everyone to go to my blog and look at it, to read it, because it's a fascinating chapter. It's stuff even I didn't realize the extent of how almost everybody who I could find a background for, whether it's in the world of entertainment, the big CEOs and so forth, they all came from wealth. But they all came from at least very stable upper middle class backgrounds. Lots of Mayflower descendants in there and so forth. It's just amazing. It's an amazing story. There are few, if any, Horatio Alger stories left, if there ever were any, or to any great extent. And where you are, and we talk about that. I have the statistics in the book also about where you are, where you start out in life is pretty much where you tend to end up. If you start out in that bottom quadrant, if you're the poor section, the vast majority of you aren't going to even make it to the next rung up in the ladder, to the last one. And almost none of you are going to make it up into what's left of the middle class. Whereas if you're born in that top quadrille, it's almost impossible to fall out. It's really almost impossible to fall, because you have that inherited wealth, you have that system in place where just your name, your reputation, you're going to have all the connections built in there. And, maybe you can possibly get disowned by your parents, but that's kind of hard to do. It's possible. You could. But owning to like a terrible drug habit or something and just a weird dysfunctional family thing, you're going to even probably become richer, because you're going to inherit your wealth, and, the next Rockefellers coming along or whatever. Who's not? I mean, the companies are going to own them. Oh yeah, I got, one of the Rockefellers. He's one of my vice presidents. So it's almost impossible to fail in that situation. So we're so far removed from what Thomas Jefferson especially dreamed of a meritocracy. We don't have a meritocracy at all in this country. And the revolving door is also seen in I have a whole chapter in there on the boards of directors. These are part-time jobs they give each other, and they basically grease each other's palms so that, the CEO of Time Magazine sits on ExxonMobil's board, and that kind of thing, where they're all on each other's boards earning a couple $100,000 a year. And these are to attend a handful of meetings. Al Gore makes $633,000 a year from Apple to attend 5 meetings a year. Now, again, this is the same marketplace that tells you they can't give minimum wage, they can't raise the minimum wage, they can't give you a 3% cost of living raise or lowest paid employees, but they somehow have the money to pay the Al Gores of the world hundreds of thousands of dollars for doing virtually nothing. I mean, what can anybody do in 5 meetings to be worth $633,000 a year? But I have all the stats in the book there. It's absolutely sinful the way it goes on. But again, no one even talks about this. I really wanted to bring it up because I was amazed that when I started looking at it, I said, well, I can't believe they're paying these people that much money. I mean, I figured I knew, and you have people like retired senators. I found one guy that was a member of Congress that was on, I don't know how many, a half a dozen or more of these boards of directors, making $200,000 a pop. So not only is he getting a fantastic pension, because they got the best pensions in the book, courtesy of the taxpayers, he's also making all this kind of ridiculous money. And as I point out, like the Vernon Jordans of the world, who I believe sit on 10 of these boards, no matter, they could be the most brilliant people in the world. How can you possibly juggle 10 jobs, plus whatever your full-time job is, where it's probably paying you millions? But this is what's wrong. It's the same people and these are the same companies that will, lecture their employees about taking pens home from work, but somehow they can waste money on already incredibly wealthy people just to pad their pockets with what amounts to pocket change. It's just an incredible situation.
Right, and what troubles me about this corporate revolving door is that quite often it appears that it's a revolving door failure.
Absolutely. I mean, there's in fact, that seems to be the easiest way to get a big payout is to run a company into the ground. Carly Fiorina, for instance, ran Hewlett-Packard into the ground, and she got a $40 million golden umbrella, which is typical. They've had executives that have gotten bigger golden umbrellas than that for completely failing in their job. And instead of firing them as they would, let's say you're, a file clerk or something, or a computer programmer or something, and you don't do the job, they're not giving you any golden umbrella. You'd be lucky to get a 2-week severance package. And instead, the particular person, Carly Fiorina, was given this huge amount for failing miserably, and she had failed before. She failed again, but that didn't stop her. With her, again, I don't mean to pick on her. She's just one example, but she did then announce she felt confident enough in her abilities to announce that she was running for president, and nobody questioned it. Wait, how? I mean, can you imagine? That would be like, say, a working class stiff that had been fired repeatedly from jobs over and over again for a poor performance and just suddenly decided to run for a public office. I mean, first of all, no working class person would be in a position to run for public. They wouldn't even take him seriously. But you see the comparison there. People would just laugh and say, that's ridiculous. But that's, in effect, what someone like Carly Fiorina and lots of other people like her have done. And I've got the stats in the book. It's amazing the kind of money these people have received, the 1%ers that are running these companies mostly into the ground. And then the other thing about the marketplace that I focused on the several of the banks that were bailed out after the 2008 bailout, another shameful episode where I think it was 6 of the 8 biggest banks that were bailed out gave out more in bonuses than their companies earned in profits that year. Now, what kind of business model is that? And apparently this is common, where these companies do give out more in bonuses than their company earned in profit. How do you stay in business like that? I don't even understand that. But again, these are the same companies that I'm sure lecture their employees about sacrifice, don't take pens home, we can't have any more, you can't bring donuts into work and have the company pay for them or whatever. But this is the philosophy, again, that's running America into the ground. This stuff that no one out here, I mean, everybody laughs at it and scoffs at it to the extent that they understand it. And up to this point, I don't think anybody's really looked at it as in-depth as I have in this book. But just, blue-collar workers all around, you talk to them, and they all laugh at the stupidity of management and the foibles and the things they get away with. So they all understand. They can't say anything about it, but everybody understands it. So I think the business world reflects the kind of government we see, where it goes to what I think is, just the huge problem that we just, need to face, and that the fact is we have incompetent and corrupt leadership across the board at every level in our society, and that's why it's impossible, really, to fix any of these problems until we get a different kind of leadership.
Now, I spent many years in retail as a college student and then as a high school history teacher, not in retail, but in education. At almost every location, I was told that I would work whenever they schedule me, that I would be available to be called in when I was not on the schedule, that I had to clock in and not be a moment late, that I had to clock out and be back for my lunch in time, that I could not make personal calls, could only have short personal chats with anyone I knew who came into the stores, had to wear some of the ugliest, most degrading uniforms I've ever seen, and had to act really happy to be there for the entire shift. Now, not only that, but when the customer was wrong, rude, or disgusting in their treatment of my fellow employees, I'd act like they were right and apologize to the customer. And I come back to this all the time, but the idea that the customer's always right was obviously created by the CEOs who never deal with the customers. Now, I was always treated as if I should appreciate the opportunity. It was as if I was always supposed to genuflect to the corporation or to the manager because, after all, they could have hired someone else. Is this really what we want for the majority of Americans, Donald?
Well, I hope not, but I can't tell you how much things have changed. I mean, when I was first starting to work in the 1970s, maybe I was just lucky, but this idea, these electronic time card systems and everything, and every job pretty much. Again, if you're like 80% of the people and you don't have a great job, then presumably at the top they're not they're not scrutinized quite the same way. But back then you had paper time cards, and you signed them. You didn't pay real close attention. Most of us didn't sign them every day. A lot of us signed them at the end of the pay period, and I can tell you that a lot of times we were paid for 8 hours and we didn't work 8 hours. We went home if there wasn't any work. Relief came. Personal phone calls, visitors on the job. These were not big things. I mean, these were, this was an era when you could smoke cigarettes everywhere. That kind of, and not that that's a good thing, but I'm saying it was just, there was so much more personal liberty, and people don't realize how much personal liberties we've lost in the last 30, 40 years, but it was a different world, and somehow things ran smoother then. With all these rules and regulations and everybody watching this, you can't do this, you can't do that. And again, a lot of it's control. When you say no phone calls, no this and that, you have to be there. I mean, it's ridiculous to say, you're driving to work and you could easily hit an unexpected backup or anything, any number of things could happen. There's zero tolerance for that now. It's like, well, you should have thought of that. Well, I'm supposed to leave 4 hours early for work because who knows what I might experience. There might be a bridge collapse, but that's the attitude they have, and it's a zero tolerance. And again, it all comes from awful management. I run into so few people at any level of management that are either even competent at all, and most of them. What are their and again, we see this reflected in our government, and I can only imagine. I don't have contact with CEOs and people at the top. I can't imagine how close-minded they are because they're thinking of nothing but greasing their palms. All they're thinking about is how big is my bonus, how big is my compensation package going to be this year. That's literally the only thing they think about. And how can I make that even bigger? And you better make that happen. And that's what they tell the people under them who are also making a lot of money. So it's in their best interest to figure out a way to make it money. And you see the same thing in government, where it's the same kind of thing, where there's no vision or foresight. Affluence means influence, where the only people our elected representatives listen to are those people with power. And they basically want to stay in their cushy positions to get all the great perks they get, to be headed for the most lucrative pension in the world, that any elected representatives have ever seen, and that's what we give our elected representatives. So there's no incentive there. And nobody cares about it's like it's amazing. It's the entire world seems to be committed, especially the working world. The atmosphere I sense all the time now is to try to make things as unpleasant as possible for the workers, to try to make things just there's no sense of there's so much stress. There's constantly, we have to do, even though we never did this before, now we have to do this. So you talk about people getting off the job. It's a wonder everybody's not an alcoholic or a drug addict that's in the working world, because it's tough, dealing with this stuff. But nobody talks about this. And of course, they've made it so where it's so hard to get a job now that if you have a job, especially if you have a job with benefits that pays relatively well, you're going to be you're willing to do almost anything. I mean, there's no telling, what some people would do that are desperate enough. You have a huge mortgage, you have kids that depend on you, that you have to, send through school and so forth. You're still raising. Well, if the boss suddenly says, you have to do something really humiliating or whatever, I don't know how many people can afford to, and who do you go to? You go up in the hierarchy, and it's the same kind of corruption everywhere you go. There's nobody there that appears to have any common sense. So the business world works that way. The government seems to work that way. And again, it all comes down to the people in charge. It's just we've put the wrong people in charge everywhere, and they keep perpetuating themselves, because once they're in, they're going to promote people like themselves. They're going to see the next generation. Okay, this guy's unreasonable. This guy's incompetent. This guy's going to do the same. He's going to look in all the wrong directions, and he's going to crack down on all the wrong things and let real, corruption and incompetence go. So that's the problem. I don't know how many people look at it like I do, but I just think it's the biggest mess that, maybe other countries are like this too. I don't know, but I can only compare it to the way it was. And I was complaining back in the 70s. I was already a young radical, but looking back on it, boy, that was a golden age. It's like, wow. But it's hard to imagine. Wait, remember when we used to be able to do that? And suddenly you can't, and everybody just kind of goes, yeah, and nobody can say, well, why? Why were things so more easygoing back then? And there was a lot less stress in the workplace than it is now, and I think that that flowed over into everyday life, and now you just see so much pressure and so much stress. And again, the fact that the employers not only treat employees the way they do now, but they want this threat of being laid off or outsourced over everyone's head all the time. And so people are just under tremendous pressure out there, and it's again, there are no easy solutions other than trying to get some good leadership in there and having rolling back some of this draconian stuff and these austerity measures, and trying to actually do things for the common good.
So when workers now organize, you take a real risk. Now, I recall a story out of Canada, I believe it was, where the behemoth of retail, Walmart, the largest employer in that town also, had its workers organize and vote to unionize. Now, the workers won, and so everyone was happy. So they show up to work the next day in a whole different kind of mood. And the workers then show up and find out that the doors to their Walmart had been closed. Walmart still won. Now, what bothers me about this story is not the obvious thing, Donald. What bothers me the most is that the vast majority of lower to middle class workers I know, upon hearing this story, laugh and side with Walmart. It is amazing. The question, though, is, how do we find some common ground between corporations and employees, and between management and labor?
Well, in this kind of climate, especially at Walmart of all places, yeah, I can understand the fear of trying to organize a union, especially in a place like that. Walmart is, as I talked about in the book, Walmart is notable for being one of the most egregious examples of corporate welfare imaginable. They, during orientation for new employees, they instruct employees on how to apply for welfare and food stamps, because they pay them so little that they qualify for that. Now, other companies may be doing it as well, but Walmart, I know, does it. And Walmart, again, it reflects the new normal, where it was founded by Sam Walton. His children inherited. Again, they did, like so many of the people at the top inherit their wealth. They literally, they just literally had things handed to them. Well, the Waltons, they're all billionaires, all the kids. They all had it handed to them from their father. So you could argue their father built it. They haven't built anything, and the idea, again, they're just they're distracted trust fund babies, basically. They don't, and so this is a model that has worked for them. It's kept their billions flowing. And again, they don't care about the impact it's had on America. All the smaller stores that were put out of business by this super conglomerate Walmart moving in everywhere. But it's indicative, and it's part of the whole corporate welfare thing, which most Americans have been trained not to look at. They're so busy, concerned with what mythical welfare queens are doing and what somebody's spending their food stamps on. They just don't seem to care about the larger picture and the incredible amounts of corporate welfare that are out there.
Right, and now it seems that the majority of the population seems to believe that the way to resolve this, or the way to resolve this in part, is to raise taxes on the wealthy. So how would that affect this?
Well, I had a discussion in that interview last week, and the guy didn't understand. I'm not for higher taxation, but the problem is lacking a complete overhaul of, theoretically, philosophically, I still have a lot of Ron Paul libertarianism in me. I'm the Thomas Jefferson guy. That government is best which governs the least.
I completely agree.
The problem is we've built up this unbelievable bureaucracy. We already have 94 million adults out of work. So let's just say, even if you got rid of Homeland Security, which should be an easy thing to do, it's only 15 years old or whatever, but no one talks about doing it, least of all conservative Republicans who seem okay with that huge bureaucracy. But if you got rid of all the unnecessary agencies in government, which are no telling how many would even be left, then you throw all those people out of work, and these people are most of them are unskilled, so they're going to be thrown out there competing with everyone else. Their lives are going to be disrupted. And so many people, we've had a situation for a while, but it's definitely a reality now that there are more people in America collecting government benefits than there are working. And, when you have a situation like that, it's very difficult to suddenly pull the plug on it all and say, okay, let's streamline government and have. So I've said, look, if you're going to, until we can figure out how to get to that point, the first thing I would do, as I talk about, is I would go back to the Grace Commission in the 1980s. The Grace Commission under Reagan, who completely ignored it, he ignored everything else about actually cutting the size of government. They discovered that fully 1/3 of all government spending is complete waste, fraud, and abuse. So you could cut taxes and government by 1/3. And I would guess that the waste, fraud, and abuse is probably maybe 50% now, but let's say it's still only 1/3. I think everyone would be real happy with an across-the-board tax cut of 33% and an across-the-board spending cut of 33%. So I would go there first, get all the waste, fraud. But again, as I said in this other interview, that presupposes that you have honest people overseeing this, which we don't have. So, and that's exactly why the Grace Commission recommendations weren't even followed. They gave their recommendations. Reagan ignored them. The Democrats obviously ignored them. Nothing happened. So they're still sitting there. But it was actually an honest commission that did a good job, unlike most of these presidential commissions. So you have that to get rid of the waste, fraud, and abuse in the government. We know that the 1950s was the golden age, or so everybody thinks. Especially conservatives like to look back on that era, and certainly it appears to be in retrospect. The top tax rate at that time was 90%. Most people don't realize how it went from 90% at the peak of American, that's when things, and again, I know there were lots of loopholes there. I don't like the idea of anybody being taxed 90%, but the problem is the country ran the smoothest it's ever ran that then, because the people with the most money, I guess, were taxed more for a large, and you had unions that were strong. By the time Reagan came along, he cut the tax top. Kennedy cut taxes. They were cut a little bit until then. By 1981, I think, when Reagan's first tax cut came, I believe he cut the top tax rate to 32%. So to go from 90 to 32% is really, that's something. So something's going to suffer in the trend. So it's not that, but I go back to Huey Long, and I know, there's a whole book in the chapter in the book devoted to Huey Long. Huey Long had a great plan. And he really wanted to go after the absolute top. Most people don't realize, and they called him a socialist and a communist. He wasn't taking anybody's wealth but the absolute top of the 1%. His plan called for the first $1 million of income to be exempt from taxes. This was in the 30s. So that would be like $50 million now. So imagine the plan today. How many people wouldn't be happy with the plan where, hey, the first $50 million of income is tax-free? So that's what he was talking about. But again, because the people that run things are in are in the plus $50 million bracket, that's where all the flack comes from.
Now, Donald, I am so glad that you brought up and wrote about Huey Long. For those who don't know, and for those who should know, who is Huey Long?
Well, Huey Long was first of all, he was the governor of Louisiana in the 1930s, and then he became the United States Senator from Louisiana. He was the most colorful political figure America had ever seen. He was receiving more fan mail as a member of the United States Senate than all the other senators combined, and than any senator has received since. They had people back when you used to be able to go in the Senate and actually watch your representatives in session, which you can't really do anymore. But back then, when the democracy was a little bit more open, he used to draw overflow crowds when he spoke. He was an incredible orator. In the age of television and the internet, I can't even imagine what his impact would be. But he was the first man really to recognize what was going on, and he talked about it, and certainly on the surface he sounds like a socialist or communist, but he wasn't. He was a populist, and there had been populists before him, Williams Jennings Bryan, and some of the populists, James Weaver, the populist ran a candidate in the 1890s, but it was mostly like built around farmers. Huey Long extended that vision of populism, and he was going after big government and big business. And that's what I am. I'm a populist. That's why Huey Long appeals to me so much. His speeches today sound just as great. This is a guy that was advocating a 30, perhaps 20-hour work week with 3 months off for workers in the 1930s. And it was only because of pressure from him and his movement, the Share the Wealth movement, was up to 10 million people by the time he died. And I have no doubt, I believe he would have been elected president in 1936 if they hadn't killed him, and I believe the government killed him. I believe he was killed by the same forces that would later kill JFK and so forth, the people that have always run things, that saw a threat to their power, and they got rid of him. But Huey Long was talking about things that that still resound today, and especially today when we see efforts to get rid of overtime and things like that. The National Labor Relations Act of 1938 was passed after Huey Long's assassination in 1936, but it was due to the impact from his pressuring on the left that caused the 40-hour work week to be born, that caused the concept of overtime to be born, that caused pensions to be born, that caused sick leave, vacation leave. All these things that up until that time, the vast majority of workers had no concept of vacation. They didn't take any time off. But it was because Huey Long was advocating, was lobbying for so much more. He wanted everybody to have 3 months off. He only wanted to have a 30, maybe 20-hour work week. I can't imagine what he would think of the situation today, but he's not credited with that. And in addition to that, as when he ran the state, he took Louisiana from a swamp, a giant swamp. He paved the entire state. He invented the concept of adult education. It was unknown until Huey Long. He invented the concept of free school books for children. He invented the concept of medical care and mental health care for prisoners. He pretty much stopped foreclosures for average people. He stopped, you talk about taxes, he cut taxes for everyone but the very wealthy. Personal property taxes were unknown under Huey Long except for the very wealthy people. And he had, I got the statistics. I was lucky enough to form a friendship with Huey Long's great granddaughter in the course of writing this book, who's trying to continue his efforts and runs an excellent website out there, and it's full of statistics on the things that Huey Long accomplished, and it was tangible, unlike the Roosevelts of the world, or the Trumans, the Lyndon Johnsons, the Bill Clintons, the Obamas, the so-called liberal Democrats, where you don't see the tangible results. Huey Long walked the walk. He didn't just talk the talk. So you saw every family saved this much in utility bills. It was things that mattered to people. That kind of stuff that impacted their lives, and that's why he is still to this day beloved by both black and white poor people in Louisiana, because he never played racial politics. He appealed. Why I love him so much. I hate identity politics. Huey Long went after the real enemy, which was the very wealthy, and he went by class. So he tried to fire back in the ever-present class war that the wealthy has always waged against the rest of us, and that's why I believe, to this day, the left should revere him, because he accomplished more than any other so-called liberal politician of his day. They despise him. I have all the quotes in the book. The American Communist Party and the American Socialist Party hated him. If you watched Ken Burns' documentary in 1985, which is actually the fairest thing ever to Huey Long, but it certainly was still incredibly biased, you just see the hatred that is dripping from leftists like I.F. Stone and people like that still hated him, and they talked about how they used to discuss assassinating him every Saturday night, and they all were happy when he was assassinated. That's the kind of left I hate. That's the establishment left, and we see it today in the social justice warrior types, and they're the ones that have run things. Huey Long was a Cynthia McKinney, Dennis Kucinich type of leftist, a populist, and he was like no other politician we've ever seen, and we haven't seen one since then. But I hope the byproduct of this book will be to try to restore his reputation, because he even being assassinated at such a young age, he accomplished so much in his state, and with the National Labor Relations Act of 1938, I think he should be credited for much of what workers have enjoyed ever since then, the 40-hour work week, overtime, and all that, because of pressure from him actually wanting workers to have even more. So he is my all-time political hero.
Well, I'm mildly ashamed to tell you that I used to be a college Republican, Donald. And by that I mean, yes, jacket and tie, hair perfectly parted on the side, all of that. And yes, Donald, I've since repented. But while many of my ideas are still conservative, and by that I mean in a Ron Paul kind of way, I do look back on those years and it boggles me how much time I, an extremely poor college student, extremely poor, spent arguing for the rich. I mean, I would always argue for the rich because I was a conservative. That's what I was supposed to do. So I've heard you talk about how unpopular these topics have been with the economic middle and lower class people that you know.
Yeah. Well, that's I was listening to talk radio a little bit today when I was driving around, which I sometimes do, and I heard one of these typical working class guys calling in and talking about how we need to get tax cuts, and I try to tell my friends, look, you can't cut if you're a working class guy, you're making $50,000 or whatever you're making or less. You're not going to ever get a tax cut. It's not going to happen. That's not who they're talking to. And Trump's plan or whoever's plan is, you just look at the plan. You're not getting anything. You might get your mortgage deduction for your house taken away from the Republicans. Actually want to do that. I guess they want to totally kill. And as a licensed realtor for many years, I do that on the side. Still, I just can't believe that they would do that. But apparently, they're seriously considering that. So because that takes away one of the main selling points of homeownership. But you hear this all the time where, we need tax cuts, and I believe the reason why, as I've said before, I believe why so many working class whites especially, why they end up supporting, like you said, the rich people, is because the social justice warrior types on the left have pissed them off so much, and they're so mad at them, they've told them so much, to beat them over the head so much with you're white and you're horrible, I hate white men, you're racist. I think that kind of preaching has gotten to the point where they're, because the rich white Republicans don't tell them that, they're willing to give them whatever they want. And they're, as I used to tell people back in I used to tell the blue collar workers I was working with, they'd maybe say, yeah, go Reagan. I said, first of all, he hasn't eliminated a single even sub-government agency. He hasn't cut the size of government at all. He didn't even eliminate the Department of Energy, which had just been created by Carter. He could have done that pretty easily. He didn't do that. He didn't cut anyone's taxes except the top people. And I said, if you looked at your paychecks, how do you think you're going to, in fact, he raised Social Security taxes, and then he started taxing Social Security benefits. So he did lots of horrible things to hurt working class people. But again, he, very much in some ways like Trump, he appealed to these people because the other side was so distasteful, especially in their rhetoric against the white working class, especially. They just felt, okay, well, they oppose those guys, so they must be great. So they end up, as you said, in this perfect way to express how much time you spent supporting the rich. And so many conservatives do that and still continue to do that. And I can't get through to them a lot. I say, you're not going to get a tax cut. I'm telling you, it's not going to happen. But you're going to get a tax cut for people who are very wealthy. And so but they've got you sold on the tax cut thing.
So from the tax cuts to the tax-free, you wrote very illuminatingly about charities in your book. Now, I was so glad to see that you wrote about the scams that are most modern large charities. Even more than that, the key Americans and world culture leaders who are now widely known as being very charitable people. So why should we be leery about donating to charities, or at least the larger ones?
Well, if you look at any of them, they all have a CEO, a person sitting at the head of them that's making at least a couple $100,000. I mean, go back to the United Way scandal, where that never went away. They exposed all the fraud and abuse there, and the incredible overhead charges there, but they got rid of the management at that time. But as I wrote in Hidden History in my section on it, business continued as usual. I mean, they're not all as bad as Bono, the rock star, the ex-rock star, his one foundation, which is aptly named because just over 1% of donations go to actual causes. Literally has a 98-point-something overhead. I mean, I got in a big argument on Facebook with some guy that interviewed me a while back who I guess is more of a conventional liberal, and I guess he's a big Bono fan. Look, I said, I'm sorry you're a fan of this guy's, but that's just ridiculous to have an organization like that. What is the point? I mean, and this guy, like so many, is very sanctimonious and he cares so much about Africa and all these causes. Well, why don't you give some of the money that's donated to them then? And we see that with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where what I was talking in the interview last week, one of the ways I think you have to go after the wealth of the 1% is you have to strip the tax-free foundations of their tax-free status and go inside and look, because all the 1%ers hide their wealth in these foundations. And if Hidden History 2, when it's published, I have a whole section in there on the Dodd Committee that was back in the 1950s that investigated tax-free foundations, and they found out some incredible things until they were shut down. I think you'd find out even more incredible things now with the growth of foundations like the Gates Foundation. Who knows what they're actually doing with that money there? But it's a tax shelter. It's a perfect way to launder money and funnel money into causes that people that give money to those foundations can't even begin to imagine. But a lot of wealth and unimaginable wealth is there. But no matter who you're giving to, unless the Salvation Army is apparently pretty good. I think they pay their head, the guy that runs Salvation Army, the nominal president, I think makes $14,000 a year. So you can't ask for much less than that for somebody that's donated his time. But most of the other ones, I had the statistics in Hidden History. It's incredible the amount of money they pay people to run these organizations, and it's just a very it's way too small an amount of what you're donating goes to the actual cause. I tell people they want to help people. First of all, help those you know in need first. But people don't want to do that for some reason. They'd rather send a bunch of money to Jerry Lewis's muscular dystrophy telethon or something instead of helping out their own family members even in need, or certainly friends and neighbors. But I would say do that, or just if you came into a large sum of money, just go, where the poor sections of town are, go over there and try to help some people that way directly. Because money given directly, you can see the effect and it has an immediate impact. Whereas if you give to one of these large organizations, you have first of all, you have to study to find out what the overhead expenses are, and you still really don't know for sure. Excuse me, how much of it is going to a particular cause. So yeah, and I think unfortunately that you would, and they've talked about that as well. I don't know that they would ever do that, but if they ever stripped the charitable, the tax deduction for charitable donations, I think unfortunately you'd see a huge drop in charity, because I think a lot of people do it for tax purposes, and certainly it's a good thing to have because it does help bring out that charitable spirit in people. But I would certainly, the smaller the organization, the better. As far as the bigger they are, the less of a percentage of what you're giving them is going to go to help anyone.
Well, it's time to get ultra conspiratorial on you, Donald. So here we go. It surprises me that most people who are struggling seem apathetic about this structural economic inequity. Now, this leads me to a question about television, one of my favorite topics, as you know. So it reminds me of a Ray Bradbury story. When the screens keep getting larger, the stereo surround sound has become more acute, and we've adopted a phrase, unbelievably, called binge watching. Is it possible that TV, and in that, yes, I would include things like sports and the Bradbury nightmare that is reality television, is it possible that TV is the largest distraction and the main reason why we just don't care about the structural economic problems that exist?
Well, sure. It's like the same reason I think people in the old days drank and still do to some extent if they get offered to do drugs. It's a way to get away from the bleak circumstances of most people's reality. And if you turn on your big screen TV, the louder it is, the bigger, the high definition, the better sound from the speakers, or of course it's going to you watch The Walking Dead or something, where, okay, well, it's even more dystopian and most people, I think you see so many dystopian shows like The Walking Dead, and there's tons of them like that. I'm usually attracted, I always give them a chance because naturally I'm conspiratorial myself, so I'm drawn to that stuff. But, exactly. So, but when you have those guys, I think people, they get a sense where there's a reason for that, because I think the makers of these shows, whether they're trying to prepare people for this actual kind of dystopian world, or they know that that's the way America and the world is heading, so they know people can relate to it. And once they turn off The Walking Dead, they go, well, at least they're not actual zombies out walking around yet. I don't have to actually worry about this yet. There's still somewhat of a structure out there. So, yeah, I think there's no doubt that people, and I think that's the fact that people they've made things like big screen, flat screen TVs and so forth affordable to some extent to just about anybody who has a job. At least they can put it on a credit card and pay for it forever or whatever, but at least it's there, and it gives them some kind of entertainment. But that's the problem, is there aren't many people like me and you that want to dwell on these things. I mean, and I that's what I said. One of the problems with trying to get through to anybody, whether it's the subject of hidden history or the subject of survival of the richest, any of these things, is that most people really aren't that interested in politics. Other than perhaps, the presidential election, they get kind of interested, and then they fall into one of the two predictable camps, and they buy the left-right paradigm nonsense. But most people, they do, because they it depresses them. And I know people, I don't want to think about that. And I understand it is depressing, but the reason why, and that's why there's so many distractions, why people are so interested in the oddly, constantly now extreme weather that we get all the time, the Hurricane Harveys and so forth. That stuff exists, so you have to have a weather channel now that talks about it all the time. And again, I don't remember even 30, 40 years ago this much extreme weather, where there should be a weather channel devoted to hurricane watches and what category it is and how big the latest blizzard's going to be. I mean, things that I never even used to give a second thought to. But when you have that stuff going on, or the predictable racial politics, the transgender, that kind of stuff, I think these all serve as distractions to get the people constantly, the latest boogeyman, whether it's North Korea, Syria. That's why we're constantly at war, because it distracts Americans from actually looking at the bleak economic picture, the bleak circumstances that they can't concentrate on, because they know that even if they can think about it, their coworkers are going to be talking about the North Korea guy or Hurricane Harvey or something. And so that's what it becomes. And then they get home, they don't want to think about it anymore at all. They don't want to even turn on the news, even if whether they believe the absurd mainstream media or not. They either don't want to be depressed by it, or people like us don't want to turn it on, because it's intolerable to watch the constant barrage of lies coming from these people. But instead, they just seek out entertainment, and they don't realize again how much propaganda is in the entertainment as well. But again, that's the best they can do, and it's very hard to engage people in even talking about it. Like you said, they don't want to talk. And I don't know how many arguments I've gotten from people that say, well, what do you define as rich? Everybody richer than you? And I try to tell them all the time, look, I don't know anybody. I literally have never met anybody in my life that would have their wealth confiscated from any kind of Huey Long type redistribution plan I could think of. Literally, most of you would benefit from it, but they don't care. Somehow they either harbor illusions that they're going to be members of the 1% someday, or they're going to win the lottery. I don't know what they think, but they somehow look for it as, you're taking from me what I built, and you don't have anything. That's the point. 80% of us have nothing. We're literally living paycheck to paycheck, but it's impossible to get through them, because they've actually, as you said, back to what you're talking about in your college, they spend this time, and they still basically defending the rich. They don't realize they're doing it, but that's what they're doing.
Yes. And speaking of the lottery and the Powerball, most people don't even understand that this is a redistribution of wealth program that works from the bottom up. It's a system overwhelmingly gambled on by the poor, who are not going to win. Yet, they are giving up their own income, and more of it, as the sign outside the gas station shows them a higher dollar sign. They're giving up more of their income to the state, the state that wastes it on corporate welfare and endless spending projects that benefit their own wealthiest benefactors. It's insane, Donald.
Yeah. Well, definitely, of course. Yeah, and it is, and the reason it's so appealing is because it's the only way that 80% they can ever see, whatever the odds are, hundreds of millions to one, or whatever it is, the astronomical odds. it's a dream. It's something, again, they could look forward to, that, okay, I can play the lottery and there's this incredibly infinitesimal chance that I might hit it, but that's the only way I can ever get into the 1%, that I can get out of this terrible, crappy set of circumstances I have, that I can suddenly not have, I can go tell the boss to F off, I can, the things that so many of us want to do but can't. Because, we have to keep our jobs, we have to, that kind of thing. So I think it remains, because it provides a very small grain of hope. And again, same people get depressed if you try, you got a better chance of getting struck by lightning twice, in the same day, or that kind of stuff. But, I don't want to hear about, and they actually, and of course, because apparently people do win it. So, so you have these winners. So and I actually had, a whole long section on lottery winners in Survival of the Richest too, where I talked about how it's amazing how once people win the lottery, they suddenly, if they win a large amount, they instantly develop the same sense of entitlement that all the rest of the 1%ers have, and they actually act as if they earned it. I mean, and it's example after example, and they don't. Most of the time, they cling to it like a baby, like it's their child, and they don't even, a lot of times they don't even want to share with their closest family members. It's not a Mac like Huey Long, let's put it that way, okay? And it's just it's funny, but that's the way it works. With that money, even if it comes in some kind of the most random set of dumb luck imaginable, instantly it comes to that sense of entitlement that I talk about in the book, where every study over and over shows, again, that unlike what the myth would have you believe, that it's the poor people on welfare that had this sense, or the lazy bums that had the sense of entitlement. No. I mean, you have people that were therapists, mental health therapists for the children of the wealthy and so forth, that talk about, there's no group in the world that it comes close to having a sense of entitlement like the 1% has. They believe they're entitled to this. They don't have, study after study shows they don't have the same kind of empathy for their fellow people. They don't. It's just, they are really rotten to the core, and I think it's that great wealth that does it. But again, most people don't think that. When you think of entitlement, they actually think of the people that are least entitled, that have nothing, and just by fact that because they're getting some kind of inadequate, tiny government benefit, well, they're entitled, But that's the people, though, again, that the working class is mad about. And again, the Republicans, much as Reagan when he cut the riches, the tax cuts at the top, they cheered them on. They will cheer on any efforts by Republicans at welfare reform, which means, again, just taking away more benefits from more people, and somehow that's going to make them, as I said, on the other hand, tearing Confederate statues down is not going to make the lives of black people any better. Taking away welfare benefits from people is not going to make the lives of any working class people better. These are laughable attempts to distract people from the big issue, which is that we have a disparity of wealth like maybe the world has never seen. It's certainly not in any first world country.
So if there's anyone out there who, after an hour of listening to you and after buying and reading your book, say, okay, now I get it, I'm engaged, what can they do? What are the best ways to resolve some of these issues, and what are some of the worst?
Well, I get asked this all the time with solutions. I mean, I think the only solution at this point, I mean, lacking, figuring out some kind of way to strip government down to its constitutional size, which, again, I just don't think is practical at this point. That's why I love Ron Paul, but I have to confine my support to his foreign policy and his civil liberties, which we're 100% on that together. I agree with him 100%. But as far as I think the Huey Long type of solution is the only thing we can do. You have to have, but how would that sell? Even Bernie Sanders was no Huey Long. As far as I know, he was more going along the FDR type, typical, maybe a little bit more radical, but a typical liberal democratic mantra, which might improve things somewhat for the working class. And at this point, probably, but then you get all the garbage that goes along with it, the social justice warrior type. So economically, it might help the working class a little bit, but ideally, I would suggest, people to read up about Huey Long, to understand the issues more. It's hard to tell people what the solutions are when we depend on people who have voices in the public arena. I mean, I have a very small voice. I mean, I get on shows like yours, but that's all I can do. I don't have any real, any kind of input on public policy. My congressional representative is going to hang up on me as quick as he would hang up on anybody else that isn't affluent. But I think what we need to do is we need to have better leadership. Now, how do you do that? I mean, as I talked about in hidden history, I think the electoral process has been totally corrupted too. I don't even think they count the votes. I don't have any confidence they do. But we need new leadership. We need honest leadership, at least enough of it to where we can turn the tide a little bit. Right now, there's so few honest people that aren't corrupt, that aren't incompetent in positions of power in business or government, that they're just overwhelmed. They may agree with what I'm saying or what other people are saying, and maybe listen to shows like this and go right on. I don't know, but they can't buck the system because they don't have enough power and they're going against they're outnumbered 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1. So it's a huge problem, and unfortunately, I hate to be pessimistic, but I think really things are going to have to collapse completely. And with the way the country is headed right now, which I wrote a new thing on my blog today, a new article where I really think we're headed for some kind of civil war. It looks as if the people that run things really want that to happen. The country is tremendously divided. So what I'm saying, it may appeal to mostly a lot of people that I oppose on many issues, which is the social justice warrior types, or it may not. I don't know. I don't know how they even think of these issues because they don't think in those type of terms. Again, for them, a great victory is getting a Confederate statue torn down. I mean, or a transgender bathroom built. I mean, these are things that don't affect anyone really, or very few people. But in my mind, I'm a civil libertarian. I'm a populist. There are very few of us left out there. So I hope I'm appealing to independent people. I know this book will appeal to lots of people. And I already heard from people that are frustrated in the workplace and they see this stuff going on all the time. They have no power. There's nothing they can do about it. They certainly can't report it to their congressional representative. But any kind of tangible solutions I have other than having someone in power. We need to have the wealth distribution. Basically you go to where the money is. The money's concentrated up top in a logjam. None of it's even trickling down anymore, let alone it needs to start streaming down. It's not doing that. We need to get back to it. We need to have politicians that start demanding to know why workers aren't being given, for the vast majority of them, aren't being given yearly raises like they used to be, why pensions are being eliminated, why there's talk of reforming Social Security, which means, again, they're just trying to screw people out of Social Security. That's what that reform means. It's not going to be to get people more benefits, that's for certain. But they're even in that arena. We need to have means testing there. We need to have all social, but most people don't realize the Social Security tax is only on the first $119,000 of income. So Bill Gates and people like that are paying on $119,000 income into the Social Security fund. That's crazy. Obviously they should be taxed on all their income. The system has never been that way. Not enough liberal Democrats have ever talked about it. The power of labor needs to be restored. It's non-existent. Back even up to maybe the 80s, certainly to the 70s. If you remember, the big labor leaders like Walter Reuther, they wielded a heavy hand, and Democratic Party politicians, and of course they were overrun with organized crime. They were corrupt in a lot of ways, but they did raise the wages and get benefits for their workers. And they were a force to be reckoned with now. Now, you don't hear anybody trying to get labor support anymore because it's toothless, because the only good unions that exist now are for professional athletes and maybe some, not even the Screen Guild, whatever it is, out in Hollywood. I don't even think their union's that great, but I guess it's decent. But those are the only unions really that and some government unions. But other than that, they still have unions at grocery stores and places, and maybe Walmart will get a union, but it'll be a hilarious union that'll charge dues, and it will still be pitifully paid with no benefits. So it's a huge problem. We need people, and unfortunately, I can sit here and I can come up with lots and lots of solutions and things that need to be done, but I don't have the power to enact them. Workers don't have the power to. We have to somehow figure a way to pressure the people that rule us into doing the right thing, finally, and they just haven't shown any inclination to do the right thing for a very long time.
So if some of our listeners want to read your work or stay in contact with you, how can they do so?
Well, my blog is Keeping It Unreal after my novel, The Unreals. It's donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. It's easy to find. I write there regularly. I just wrote a new one today, which is I titled it America's Controlled Demolition, because I think we're being demolished by the leaders, and I think we're headed for civil war. I hope I'm wrong, but I think we are. And obviously my books, The Unreals is my novel, and Hidden History and Survival of the Richest are out there on Amazon. Everywhere. You can Google me. You can find my old interviews or whatever. I mean, I talk about this stuff quite a bit, and I write about it quite a bit. And there's a lot to talk and write about, and I think we need more independent thinkers and more alternative shows like yours that are doing great work and providing a platform for people that are not just spewing out the mainstream party line.
He is Donald Jeffries. The book is Survival of the Richest. I'm sure we could talk all night, but we will definitely talk again. He's a friend of the show, and he's a friend of mine. So, Donald, thanks for being on the Midnight Rider News Show tonight.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
I'm S.T. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back. On August the 16th, 2017, Midnight Rider News released our tribute to Jim Marrs. 28 researchers, colleagues, friends, and fans joined Midnight Rider News in discussing the life, career, and memories of Jim Marrs. If you would like to hear that tribute, go to MidnightRiderNews.com and download episode 13 of the Midnight Rider News Show today. The title to Donald Jeffries' newest work, Survival of the Richest, is very apropos. The structure has been created by and for the protection of the rich. The problem is that it is not a system designed to protect the middle or lower classes as well. One structure did not fit all. Now, I've said this for years. Part of the problem in America is that our work ethic is overvalued by those who are doing the work and undervalued by those paying for it. Always remember this: labor is a simple exchange of work for cash. In a perfect system of labor exchange, the employer would have the exchange tilted slightly toward his or her interests, enough to keep the business open and maintain a steady stream of profitability. The system is broken when the workers give too little in exchange for too much, which is what can happen when some systems are over-unionized, or when the employer pays too little for the work being provided. That is what is happening in a majority of situations in America and around the world today. The exchange of labor for cash is too heavily weighted in favor of the employer. Those are the structural problems that can be fixed. What I find more perplexing are the psychological problems. There's a condition called Stockholm Syndrome. It was most prevalent in situations like concentration camps or plantations. Today you'll see it in places like prisons. It exists where there is a very well-defined delineation between those who are the authorities and those who are not. What happens with Stockholm Syndrome is that the oppressed begins to empathize with, side with, defend, or even desire to become the oppressor. It was the heavy-handed Jew in the concentration camp who wanted to be in with the Nazis. It is the Negro slave who stood in the house and badmouthed the field slaves to the master. It's the prisoner who cleans for and gives information to the guards in exchange for favors or food. Sadly, the Stockholm Syndrome has now crept into our workplaces. Why does management have to police anyone when the workers can be pushed to police one another? Why does a worker at a minimum wage job where the employees are treated disrespectfully still talk about how someone else isn't working hard enough? Why is it that the worst managers are those who some workers work hardest to impress? And how did we get to the point in America that we too have stopped expecting or demanding better pay for better conditions? Instead, we have been made to believe that we should just be happy to have the job. Worse yet, if there is someone on staff who wants better pay and better conditions, and they begin discussing it, it will be the workers who begin labeling that person as a troublemaker or a complainer. In essence, what they're saying is, don't rock the boat. We're happy that the master has come down on high to bless us with our $8 an hour so we can be $15,000 under the poverty line. This is the modern Stockholm Syndrome, and it is because the labor exchange is not only off, it is broken. I feel sorry for my long-past grandfathers and great-grandfathers today. I feel sorry for the elderly men I hear discussing work. And I feel sorry for the lower classes who treat being an underpaid, overworked employee as a matter of pride. I'm a worker, they'll brag. That guy isn't a worker. He doesn't do real work. I work. It's sad that that has become commonplace and even respected. Our grandfathers defined themselves by their work. Many coal miners in my region did work hard, and they also died from it. Is that a great work ethic? Is that a fair exchange of labor? The more we allow ourselves to be defined by our work, the less individualized we are. And that's exactly what they want. Because what are we looking for? And what are we working for? Are we working odd hours for little pay just so we can go home, go to sleep, and get up to work the next day? What quality of life are we getting out of this? What life experiences are we gaining? And why in the world are we defending the structure that makes it so? Instead of our high schools and colleges teaching us how to become a valuable employee to someone that will undervalue us, we should be teaching about entrepreneurship, how to make your own way, define your own hours, be in control of your own life, raise your own family how you see fit, and profit from your own work. Instead of looking for appreciation and acceptance from someone who makes more than you for whatever the reason, look for value in yourself. And find a way in life for your work to benefit you. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to St. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at midnightridernews@gmail.com. And be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.